Hi, my name is Edna, and I'm going to present today a story about work practices and perceptions from women core developers in open source software communities. There are many studies that investigate the gender bias in open source communities. Nonetheless, little is known about the existence of vertical segregation in open source communities. In this study, we explore the issue of vertical segregation and study the work practices and perceptions of gender bias from the point of view of women core developers. So, we have answered the following research questions. 1. How common are women core developers in open source communities? 2. Are there differences in the work practice of women or men core developers? 3. How do women core developers perceive gender bias and gender diversity in open source communities? 4. What are the actions women core developers consider important to make open source communities more inclusive? In the first two research questions, we address the issues of vertical segregation and work practices of core developers. In the third and fourth ones, we address the perceptions of women core developers on gender bias. To answer these questions, we have used a mixed method study. First, we have used the GitHub API to search for the 100 most popular projects written in the 15 most popular programming languages at GitHub to identify women core developers and to understand their work practices when contributing to open source communities. As we study core developers, we focus on sufficiently large projects with sufficiently many committers. To determine the thresholds, we compute the first quartiles of the distribution of source lines of code and number of committers and exclude projects having less source lines of code or less committers than the thresholds. In this way, we preserve 711 projects written in 14 languages with at least 5,183 source line of code and 33 committers. We identify core developers using the notion of the truck factory, and we have identified the gender of all core developers using two gender identification tools, Gender Computer and Nensor. This table presents the summary of the dataset with core developers. In the second study, we have surveyed the women core developers we have identified in the first study to understand their perceptions about gender bias in open source communities. We have identified 45 women core developers. We could not confirm the gender of 6 of them. Moreover, among the 39 women core developers, 3 of them are core developers contributing to 2 projects in other datasets. So, our target population has 36 women core developers. We have contacted them by email. Over a period of 3 weeks, we have received answers from 35 of these developers. Among 711 GitHub projects, we have identified 1,954 core developers. 45 core developers are recognized as women, while 1,717 are recognized as men. We have found women core developers in 37 projects. 2.3% of core developers identified was women in other dataset. This finding suggests an underrepresentation of women core developers in open source software projects. We also explore two additional questions to better understand the work practices of women core developers. How do the number, frequency, and size of contributions of women core developers compare with the number, frequency, and size of contributions of men core developers? Accordingly, we have mined the commute history from the 36 Women Core Developers (WCD), and we handily generate three datasets with men core developers (MCD1, 2, and 3), and have collected their commute history. Each one of these datasets comprises 36 men core developers. Regarding the size of the contributions, we have computed the total lines of code and the number of files added, changed, and deleted from the set of contributions of MCD1, 2, 3, and WCD. No statistically significant differences could be observed. Considering these results, we conclude that there is no difference in terms of number, frequency, and size of commits with regards to the gender of core developers. In the second question, we have used the approach of Hattori and Lanza to investigate the difference on the type of contributions of women core developers that differ from the men core developers. Women core developers (WCD) contributes more with corrective and re-engineer activities, while the sets of men core developers (MCD) contribute more with management activities and the ones that we were not able to classify. There is no difference in the forward engineer activities. Regarding our second study, the survey, we found that women core developers are in general young. 51.4% of the women are between 18 and 25 years old, and almost 80% of them are younger than 35 years old. 68.6% of the women core developers consider gender diversity in open source communities to be very important. According to them, gender diversity can improve team communication and attract new women. Even a population of core developers, one third of the women believe that at least one of their contributions had not been accepted due to gender bias. Moreover, 11.4% often recognize gender bias while someone appraises their contributions. Gender bias appears whenever a contribution from a women developer receives less positive feedback. Gender bias also appears in open source communities through the language used. Avoid gender pronouns, for example, with using guys is very common, and this gives an idea that it is assumed that contributors are mostly men. So, modern language would help. There is the use of inadequate language in open source software communities. The women core developers suggest to make open source communities more inclusive. 1. Promote women-specific mentorship program. 2. Promote women to senior roles. 3. Organize women-specific events such as outreach, local meetups, or even tech groups. And 4. Avoid gendered language, for instance, using guys. So, in summary, we have in this work studied a different interpretation of gender bias in open source communities. Our finds show that open source communities present both horizontal and vertical segregation. Only 2.3% of the core developers are women. This group of women core developers contribute in a similar fashion as other groups of men core developers, considering frequency and size of contributions. The last but not the least, women core developers believe that gender diversity is very important in open source communities. Thanks so much.